much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Clemente Diaz. I'm one of the co-chairs of the CUNY IO Practitioners Network. And if you don't know what the CUNY IOP network is, it's basically a group of administrators within CUNY who are interested in applying the theory, research, and practice of industrial organizational psychology or workplace psychology to higher ed. So today we have two speakers that we're very happy to have with us, both of whom are CUNY alums. So we have Rebecca Harmata and Lorena Solis, who apart from being CUNY alums are doctoral students in IO psychology. And they'll be talking to us about effective DEI strategies, more importantly, the evidence behind these strategies. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to them. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Yeah, so we're going to go over effective DEI strategies and evidence behind them and how to create a sustainable change. We have some slides today. Really, we're going to introduce ourselves, define DEI, and then go into how are we going to create a training that targets our definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we can align our goals with our design. And then go into creating a sustainable change, key takeaways, and we'll hopefully have 15 minutes for y'all to ask questions and for us to answer. So my name is Rebecca. I'm a PhD student in IO at the University of Georgia. I did my master's at San Diego State, also in IO, and I started actually out in CUNY at Brooklyn College with Dr. Jennifer Feitosa, and that's where I met Lorena. Right now, I'm doing research in DEI. Current projects are intersectional microaggressions, and we just submitted our R&R for a neurodiversity IOP paper, arguing that your diversity statements within organizations and organizations in general should include neurodiverse people. Other projects include personal selection and personality.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Lorena or Lorena. People have a difficult time with the R's. So yes, I'm a current PhD candidate in psychology, specializing in industrial organizational psych at the University of Calgary. So it's actually here in Canada. So greetings from Canada. But I did do my my master's at Brooklyn College, as well as my undergrad at Buffalo State College. So I'm a Brooklyn, New York native. My research interests are primarily in diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially social justice. We tend to diminish the idea of social justice a lot when it comes to DEI. So I tend to look at that from a more social justice perspective rather than management perspective. I do a lot of gender studies in STEM occupations, but we particularly focus a lot, rather than focusing on why discrimination exists, because we all know why it exists, historical exclusion and historical injustices. I look at how it's still perpetuated in today's workforce and in today's society. So it's more about how is discrimination perpetuated rather than why it exists, which is a very important question to ask right now. So that's me in a nutshell.
And we wanted to start with asking y'all how do you define diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I encourage you to use the chat box to introduce yourself, where are you from, what colleges are you representing, and what your definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion are. Or feel free to unmute and give us the definition as well. We'll just take a couple minutes for that to pop up. This can be like different identities, either targeting each of the words, diversity, equity, and inclusion separately. Yeah, people's backgrounds, people's perspectives. This one's more towards equity, creating opportunities and eliminate various barriers. Yeah. This one's inclusion, ensuring all of the students feel welcome, valued, and important at school. Different life experiences. Ooh, that's a good one. Awareness of implicit biases as gatekeepers in higher education. Focusing on equal outcomes, using equity and including valuing different experiences and voices. Yeah, for staff and recruitment and talent. So the purpose of this was to just see how everyone defines diversity, equity, and inclusion, and kind of just show that we all come from different perspectives. Taking a look at our policies and procedures, we're going to touch on a lot of these things within the presentation as well, and how we can incorporate our trainings and really embed diversity, inclusion, and equity into the structures of our organizations. So thank you for those that participated. And as questions come up throughout the presentation, I encourage you to use the chat function. Just for the sake of time, we are going to go through the presentation and then answer the questions at the end. So really what we wanted to do is anchor our presentation into common language. So diversity is compositional differences within a group of people. A lot of times people kind of discuss diversity as the language is like, people are diverse, people are not diverse, groups of people are diverse, and it's an attribute. Equity, on the other hand, are accommodations and access to resources that we provide. So taking into the context of history and that people have always had equitable access to different resources and accommodations, we need to provide those resources to our students, faculty, and staff so everyone has equitable access. And then finally, we're going to touch on inclusion as well. And that's when members of a group feel a sense of belonging and they feel included. So CUNY actually does a really great job of incorporating these things into their mission statement. And I just wanted to read it. The university respects individuals while acknowledging the differences among them. These differences include, but are not limited to, race, national origin, ethnicity, religion, race, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and SES. However, to create a vibrant academic, intellectual, and cultural environment for all, the university must move beyond representation to genuine participative membership. So therefore, the university seeks to develop a community that is inclusive of all individuals and groups. And I really appreciated this definition and wanted to give CUNY a shout out to doing a great job of encompassing DEI in their mission statement. So how will we achieve this? I'm going to pass it off to Lorena to discuss how we create a safe environment for DEI strategies.
I was on mute. Okay. So creating a safe, the first step is to create a safe environment. And really, when it comes to the creation of a safe environment, the onus is on leadership and how they exemplify safety within a particular space. Let's see. Okay, so creating a safe environment. So a safe environment prior to or during and after a DEI training is essential to successful positive changes in attitude. And many of us may be familiar with the concept of psychological safety. And in a nutshell, psychological safety is this feeling of feeling safe within our environment. Work group involvement is more about a sense of belonging. So this would be more the attributions of inclusion. And then the emphasis on respect and values of differences, which we saw in the CUNY mission statement. So when we're talking about feeling safe, so when we're talking about feeling safe, a great example is a woman who expresses views that are associated with her female identity. So for example, if I want to express the need for equal pay for men and women, I would feel safe to do so without any backlash or any repercussions, right? And understanding that that doesn't have a backlash on my identity as a woman. So again, leaders have this responsibility to make sure that everyone feels safe, to share their concerns, to share their ideas, to communicate safely without any backlash to one's identity. Work group belonging is more so a sense of belonging, as I mentioned. Work group involvement, yeah, sense of belonging. So this is feeling like an insider, feeling like you're part of the team or the group that you're you're associated with. It's also having access to critical information and resources. Information and resources are a sign of power and status, and oftentimes we withhold particular information and resources to attain power. But when people feel belong, they have access to that, right? So one example would be an academic department dominated by tenure-track faculty, who typically tend to be in the position of power, support the full sharing of information to all junior faculty. So you essentially have mechanisms or processes within your department that ensure that everybody is being communicated the same information. You're not finding out about things through the grapevine or through other resources. You essentially have, mechanisms that can effectively communicate all information and transparency to all of its members, regardless of their positionality in the department. And then feeling respected and valued is, again, more so in terms of our identities. So being treated as an appreciated and esteemed member of the group. And this overall essentially creates an accountability for any remarks that devalue or disrespect identity groups. So sometimes we hear some microaggressions that are, again, denoted to identity. For example, within academia, something that we see a lot, and it can happen to our faculty members or to any employee, female in particularly, is getting comments about what they're wearing. I know this happens a lot to TAs, teaching assistants, and female academics, where their evaluations will represent comments not about what they taught and how they taught it, but rather what they're wearing, right? Or how they're dressing or how they're presenting, right? So essentially in a inclusive environment, safe environment, and feeling respected and valued, people would focus ideally on what we have to offer rather than how we look or our affiliation to our social groups. Okay, and then now I'll pass it over to Rebecca.
So first, we need to identify the goals of our training, and then we need to design our training based on those goals. So there are 3 fundamental goals of DEI trainings that has manifested in analytic research. One is to create awareness to improve the environment in which people are in. 2, to acknowledge biases and prejudices and to learn skills to address these. And 3, to recognize diversity as an asset and to leverage diversity to improve performance. A lot of times it's called like the business case of diversity. So overall purpose of DEI trainings is to create an attitude change. And there are ABCs of attitudes. So 3 ways in which you can target attitude changes are through affect. How do people feel about a topic? How do people feel about different groups of people? How do people behave? How are people going to act towards other people? And C, cognition. How are people thinking about other groups? So when we're targeting affect, the appeal for this is that you're going to create empathy and compassion. And these go a long way to influence behavior. However, the challenge also is that you may create unintentional negative feelings towards outgroups. So when you are doing an affect-based training for diversity, equity, and inclusion, you should use active learning strategies and create longer trainings or multiple trainings to create like a dialogue around DEI. So some active learning strategies that make training more effective are interaction. Interaction is important no matter what modality the training is presented, but especially for affective outcomes. So how people feel about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this can include individual and group exercises, scenario-based learning, and role-playing. Although lectures are still a prominent format, this is okay to use still. Like for a lot of people, lectures are very effective. but you should incorporate as much interaction as possible to facilitate discussion. If you have just presenting information, it seems more of a control aspect, but you want to incorporate interaction to make people feel heard, and you want to answer people's questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially in that safe space that Lauren talked about before. And the length of training really matters. So research suggests that trainings of 4+ hours are more effective for affective-based outcomes because this allows for more interaction and discussion. Participants have time to process information and respond versus react. So smaller, shorter interactions for trainings are going to get more reactions, and these are more possibly negative reactions. So having the trainings last longer allows individuals to overcome those negative reactions and really process and respond. And this also promotes a sense of importance. So if your organization is placing more emphasis and more time on these trainings, that to your participants signals that you care about diversity, equity, and inclusion versus like a half an hour or 2-hour training. The second ABC for attitude change is behavior. So the appeal for changing a behavior and having a diversity, equity, and inclusion training that targets behavior is that there's an immediate increase from pre to post-test training evaluations. So at the beginning, you're going to ask people how they behave, you're going to measure behavior, have the intervention, and you're going to see an immediate increase. And that is a visible change in behavior. However, the behavioral change from one-time diversity, equity, and inclusion training, that's not sustainable, and that's not going to represent the actual behavior over a long-term time frame. So the solution to behavioral change after diversity, equity, and inclusion training is to create incentive and reward structures that help promote this behavior that you want to see from your employees. And you want to also focus on transfer of training and target the underlying attitudes. So changing the affect and changing the cognition surrounding the behavior to make it more sustainable. So what is transfer of training? Transfer of training is when the knowledge, skills, and ability can be generalized to different contexts. So can they manifest this behavior in different settings? Can they perform this behavior with different people and different situations over time? So things to consider when you're talking about transfer of training is that people must be sufficiently motivated to carry those knowledge, skills, and ability from the training to, quote, like their normal everyday environment. They have to be motivated to do that. And of course, higher levels of motivation are going to increase the effectiveness of your training. So some things like creating resources as cognitive reminders. So sometimes people just need like the mission statement, the diversity, equity, and inclusion mission statement in front of them on their desk, I don't know, on their computer screen, just to remind them that, hey, this is something, this is one of our core values, and that's going to have them think like twice before they act. They're going to be reminded that, hey, we have had, we want a behavior change. There's a certain way that we're going to act in this context. And this also highlights the importance of safe environments and error management. It's a very scary thing to go into diversity, equity, and inclusion training and have someone say that, hey, we want a change in behavior. So when we want this changed in the actual environment, work environment, it could be scary to make mistakes. It could be scary to ask for help and ask for clarification after the training. So this is just highlights the need of safe environments and error management. So creating a culture about like, okay, what are we going to do if someone does make a mistake? If someone does do something that contradicts what we did in the training, we need to like create a cultural change and a cultural shift to acknowledge those things. And participant motivation, there's something called mastery or goal orientation. And this is just to highlight, just to be aware of the initial motivation of participants at the beginning of the training. People like feeling that they're fulfilling goals and that they have an actual goal that they're that they're contributing to, and this is the knowledge acquisition to behavioral change. And people need social support. This is also a very strong motivation for people to change their behavior. It's not just that your leader, your manager, or the diversity, equity, and inclusion manager is giving this presentation, but people need to see that their peers are also embodying these behavioral changes. And they're more influenced by their peers than their supervisors. So if their peers are not taking part into these changes, then they're less likely to do that. And finally, targeting cognition. The appeal here is knowledge acquisition. People like learning. And research has shown large effects of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings on cognition. However, if you are going through the cognition route and you want knowledge acquisition, people may feel like they're an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion. This will decrease empathy, sensitivity, and openness to change. So just be very careful in framing cognitive trainings for DEI. So the solution towards this is that frame it as an education, like it's a continuous learning opportunity versus you're training people on the right and wrong of how to engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a lot of times people use specific stereotypes and they highlight the stereotypes of different groups and saying, hey, this group is typically viewed in this manner, but just be aware that that also reinforces those stereotypes and creates a negative feeling in your participants because evidence has shown that they sometimes mistake those examples as what your organization views these groups of people. So they're just projecting that onto the person that is presenting this information. So avoid reinforcing negative stereotypes and really focus on the inclusion aspect that yes, there are differences in groups, but we value that. And you don't have to go into the specific differences about why there's what kind of negative stereotypes there are, just to be aware that they are, and then you are being inclusive. Other design considerations that are outside of the ABCs are the instructor characteristics. So there's evidence, so if you're going affective trainings and you're targeting the how people feel about diversity, equity, and inclusion, evidence shows that your direct manager or supervisor has a bigger impact on these changes than using HR or the DEI manager. But if you are going the cognitive route, it's the opposite effect, which was pretty interesting, that the internal personnel, so HR or diversity, equity, and inclusion manager, those are more effective at cognitive changes. This might be due to the psychological safety with direct managers and supervisors, the ability to have a discussion with them, and that may contribute to more affective changes than the cognitive. It's like a very impersonal thing. It's just knowledge acquisition, and it may be more in line with HR. But just some things to keep in consideration depending on the goals of your training. And the other thing is training format. There's a lot of different ways that you could go about doing this. So you can have it as a voluntary or mandatory. You can do awareness and skill or awareness only. It could be in a compliance or legal content or training focus on differences or similarity and similarity or differences. Actually, meta-analytic effects have shown that there's really no difference between the two. It's really important to create an environment in which discussion is encouraged and inclusion is emphasized rather than the difference in training formats. And then specific DEI trainings targeting specific identities. So this is why it's really important to identify and define what diversity means to your organization or exactly what you're trying to change and be more inclusive about. So right now, like a lot of ableism is becoming a very hot topic in organizations. So if that is something that your organization is concerned about, create a DEI specifically for ableism in your organization. A specific DEI training done well is more effective than a broad DEI training done poorly. So this is just highlighting the need to just define what diversity means. Usually when people think about diversity, they automatically go towards race and ethnicity, but there's tons of different identities out there that may be important to your organization. then I'm going to pass it off again about how we can embed these changes into our policies and culture to create a sustainable change and reinforce these behaviors.
All right. Okay, so it's my turn again. Okay, so far the training has mostly focused a lot, or the training aspect has been focusing a lot on awareness of diversity, essentially, what are people changing behaviors and attitudes with regards to diversity. But really the next step is, how do we actually build an inclusive organization? Because inclusion is different. As we identify, inclusion is more about a sense of belonging rather than just differences. And this sense of belonging should be cultivated by all of the employees, not just the racial or ethnic minority or the minoritized employees per se. Like, all people should feel included, right? And in your organization, you can probably identify inclusion strategies by two things, usually prevention and promotion. So a prevention orientation is more about preventing discrimination. And this would look like our official or formal organizational policies and compliances to laws, right? So these are the legal recourses. This is what we do to prevent any type of discrimination or exclusion. And most organizations have this, and most organizations focus on this. It can be also thought as very reactive. So if something happens, we have legal recourses and we react to whatever discrimination is experienced. Usually it's also management who's in charge of this. So this is the management of discrimination. In short, it's diminished. This can include things like addressing subtle or overt forms of discrimination at all levels. So this could be even things like your grievance compliance, if you have some. So the macro will be things like the hiring, the retention, the promotion of people, whereas the micro would be more of the interpersonal and microaggressions, and even the everyday subtle forms of discrimination that people experience. So this is all what we would call prevention orientation strategies. But what we need to start focusing is on promotion. How do we promote inclusion though? So we know how to prevent exclusion, but how do we actually promote it, right? And this is more about our, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, so just like a promotion of it. So one way to do this, to promote inclusion, is having influence on decision making. So employees feel that their ideas and perspectives are influential and that they are listened to. Oftentimes, and especially in the time that we're in right now, we often hear about creating EDI committees and having more EDI committees and people that focus on EDI. And my thing is like, no, we need EDI in key committees, right? We need EDI in all committees, not just the EDI committee, because some committees have power, right? But they're very homogeneous. And so we need to ensure that every committee has EDI, because essentially these committees have influence over key decisions. And if you don't have EDI into these committees, then you're essentially already marginalizing people. So rather than focus on the EDI committee, how do we embed EDI in every committee or in every aspect of our organization? And partially is having influence on decision making. Authenticity, so this is the idea of uniqueness. Employees can share valued identities that may differ from dominant organizational cultures or employees' lifestyles without repercussion. So for example, religious minorities are given the opportunity at work to wear clothing and engage in practices that reflect their affiliation. So this is the idea that we don't have to check our cultural identity or our ethnic identity or the identities that are close to us at the door. We can bring them to the organization. We can bring our unique self without any type of repercussion. Again, recognizing, honoring, and the advancement of diversity. So these are the implementation of ongoing strategies that contribute to diversity at all levels. So oftentimes we'll hear like, oh, these organizations are very diverse, they look very diverse, but we only see diversity at one level. And typically in academic institutions, and especially departments, we typically see diversity at the student level and in the administrative level, but what about the tenure level? What about the faculty level? What about the head of the department? You know, so we start to see the level of diversity decrease as we get higher up in the hierarchy. So what are we doing to essentially allow for more diversity at all levels rather than just the student level or the administrative level? How do we move upwards? So this is trying to eliminate impediment of upward mobility, including equitable salaries. advancement opportunities for members of historically marginalized identity groups at work. So again, these are just strategies that essentially allow, recognize that there are barriers at each level and not just at one level. Our hiring practices overall, so how exactly are we hiring? And do our hiring practices essentially enforce some type of adverse impact? So these are our tools used to hire employees. Tools used to hire employees should reflect job performance. So oftentimes we don't necessarily always focus on the job performance. We focus on other types of concepts within the interview process. So essentially trying to focus on the job performance, trying to make sure that we are collecting, knowledge, information on knowledge, abilities and skills that are relevant to the job and not outside. So typically structured interviews would allow us to do this, right? Measure a range of competencies relevant to the job. So for example, again, we know that typically the research shows that Black and Brown individuals or members of those social groups tend to do less in writing skills. But if writing skills are not part of your job performance per se or a direct measure, try to include a range of competencies rather than just one. And the other thing too, and this goes to the third point, removing any form of stereotype threat. Part of the reason why Black and Brown people may essentially do worse in these types of cognitive testing or writing assessment is because they're stereotypes. There are things that threaten their identity that then influence how they perform. So it's not that there's an inherent incompetence, it's rather that have you removed any type of threat in the environment that signals that they signals a threat to their identity, right? So one example that I like to use is gender, mathematics and gender. So oftentimes it's assumed that women are inherently incompetent or aren't doing well in math. But if you know a lot of stereotype threat and the studies behind it, what they showed was that essentially they placed two groups of women in two different rooms, right? And they gave them a math test. And what happened in the math test was that in one test, they actually signal threats to their gender identity. They told them that they were going to do bad, like that typically women do bad in math, just things that kind of like signal things to their identity. And in the other room, they didn't tell them anything. And so what they found was that the women that were not told anything about math, about their identity in connection to their math skills, they did pretty well. Whereas in the other room, they didn't. So try to remove that threat, any threat that you may have, or any signaling in the environment that can signal people's identities, and just remove any form of adverse impact overall. So these are things that we want to be cognizant about. Performance management, this is also one of my things that we want to consider. So remove any unconscious bias from the performance review. So are you actually focusing on the job performance, or again, are you focusing on what people are wearing, how they talk, their accents, things that don't necessarily have to do with the performance or how they're performing. So I mentioned the thing about women and women faculty and TAs, but even international academics, right? International faculty, they often have comments about their accents and things like that. So these are things that could be very unconscious and can signal things to us about our competencies and status. Improve the delivery of the performance review. So again, are we focusing on performance or are we focusing on more personal details? Reviews should focus on performance related information only. So these are all in just a relationship onto like how are we collecting our data about people's performance, as well as whether our reviews are actually focusing on performance or other things. The other one that I would want to also emphasize is, for example, when it comes to leadership, again, women are often viewed as less likely to be leaders, but research shows that they practice leadership more democratically, meaning that they involve all members of their group or team, whereas typically men don't. And if your performance review doesn't incorporate characteristics of a more democratic leadership, then obviously your women are going to fail that part of the performance review. So essentially, what kind of unconscious biases do you have in your performance review? Or how exactly are you measuring things or defining things like leadership, communication style, sales, whatever the case may be? Is there some gender, racial, unconscious bias within our definitions of those leadership qualities? The other thing too that I would really like to focus on, just to kind of give us hope, because we can't change systems in a day or in a week. We can only do the best that we can as individuals, you know, and it's not to discourage people, but there are things that we can do personally that can make us still feel like we're doing something. So there's the role of employees, and then there's the role of managers. And so one of them is, as employees right now, what we can do is provide support. And what that means is just listening. Sometimes our coworkers will experience microaggressions and macroaggressions that we don't necessarily have control over, but the most that we can do is probably support them and listen to them and provide an empathetic ear, rather than try to convince them that they're, you know, they're wrong, or that they interpreted the situation wrongly. You know, we can't insert ourselves into the experience of our peers, especially if we don't belong to the group that they belong to. So, for example, if you're a man and the person is a woman, you know, and she's identifying aggressions that target her identity as a woman, you know, as a man, you don't know what that experience is really like, right? So just provide a listening ear. Empathetic listening is just something that can go a long way, because sometimes people don't have a safe space to go somewhere. So that's just one thing that we can do. Confront bias, so intervention. So again, if we're in a position of power, or if we're able to do this, we feel safe to do this, let's intervene. Let's make sure that we're kind of stopping it right there. Again, this is very dependent. Typically, you know, I don't know if CUNY offers bias interventions, but I went to a bias training and it was really great. And they just give you skills on like different methods of intervening as a bystander. And when do you want to intervene? Sometimes we can intervene with humor. Sometimes we can intervene by asking more explanation. Sometimes we can intervene. Sometimes we do want to intervene, especially when it's a person of power, right? So if our managers, our supervisors are kind of perpetuating some type of inequality, like sometimes we want to intervene there and then. But again, it just really depends. You know, it's easy to say to confront bias, but there's so many factors that come to play. So this is what we can just do as employees. It's nothing big, but it can go a long way, as I mentioned. Role of managers: be aware of your own blind spots. We all have them. We all have them. We're not safe from them. So just be aware of that. Do some self-awareness. Question your own assumptions. Question assumptions in general. Again, you know, especially as IO psychologists and management, we often look at things through the perspective of a manager and not an employee. So how do employees perceive these different things, right? There's a status differences. So let's question our assumptions. And overall, just be a role model of inclusion. Like usually it's leaders who embed indicators of culture, right? People will look to the leader to see how I should behave, to see how I should perform. We look to the leader to see what gets evaluated, what gets, you know, what gets praised, what doesn't get praised. So as leaders, we really have even a bigger role than employees. So, you know, you'll be the role model of inclusion. Yeah, and that's it for me. I'll pass it over to Rebecca.
So just in general, some key takeaways for managing diversity in the workplace. One, create a safe, inclusive environment. So that first topic, like it really matters what the culture of your organization is. Create a sense of belonging and psychological safety. You need to define measurable goals. It's good to have goals in general, but to have them measurable, especially if you are getting funding from federal or state sources, there needs to be goals that have been defined, that are being measured, and you need to target and design your training accordingly. So those ABCs of attitudes, are you addressing affect, behavior, or cognition? And make sure that you have different design elements that are most effective for those ABCs. Engage in critical evaluation. The evaluationary training must be at multiple time points. If anything, the takeaway here is that a one-time point diversity, equity, and inclusion training is not going to do much unless you embed this into the culture of your organization and to create a sustainable change. So the DEI should be embedded within the policies and culture. That goes back to the hiring practices, that goes back to the performance evaluation, and that also goes with how we're conceptualizing student success. Are we disaggregating our data, and when we're looking at key performance outcomes, are we looking at different equity groups that are important to the university and to the state? And we need to just continuously engage in critical evaluation and make sure that we're continuously improving, that it's being part of our culture of our organization. And that is what we have prepared for you. It's kind of like a crash course in DEI strategies. And I see we have some stuff in the chat over here, but we definitely want to hear your questions. If there's anything you're struggling with in particular or want to know, please pop it into the chat, and I'll take a look to see if there's any stuff in here that we can answer.
Hey, can I ask?
Yes.
Hi. So thank you so much. I'm really interested in the unconscious bias piece, Lorena, that you were talking about. And I think I wrote it correctly. You mentioned a bias intervention training. Did I get that phrase? Because I'm Googling, that's where I struggle with the sort of like the idea that we all have implicit bias and people like buying into that, right? I almost get this like answer of like, oh, that's great for you. Like, I'm fine, you know? So bias intervention training sounds really interesting if you have that resource.
Yeah, I can share it. I think I can share the one that I came to, but it's a very interesting thing because sometimes there's so many, it's so easy to say like, oh, let's intervene. But if you're in a lower position as your coworker, you know, you also risk you also have a risk in your own identity. So sometimes I try to tell people like, even if you don't intervene, like question why you didn't intervene. Maybe the next time you can intervene. Maybe the next time you are. Sometimes we're also not prepared for what people say. Sometimes people comments just take you off guard, and you're like, "Whoa, did I just really say that?" Or like, "Did I just really hear that?" So sometimes I try to tell people not to feel guilty for not intervening. Just think like just you know, kind of self-aware of that. But yeah, especially you know, because things like tone matters. Again, you can use humor. You can maybe even use a question answer, like, what did you mean by that? There's so many methods of intervening. What was the other one too? Just there's so many factors of who says it and how they say it. With implicit bias as well, that's really, really hard. There are some implicit bias tests that have out there. But what I personally, I think people really care, and I think people really want to be better. But I think the problem is how we approach it, and often we approach it as an attack of like, you have implicit bias, rather than, you know, kind of easing into it. You know, and this is especially for white folks, right? Oftentimes, what happens is that we all seek safety. We all want safety as humans. That's just a human need. It doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter your color. It doesn't matter your gender. We all want safety. But the way that safety manifests for different people is differently. For a lot of racialized minorities or minoritized people in general, is just kind of being our authentic self. Whereas for white people, it may be maintaining the status quo. So how do you have that, right? Like, how do you balance that as like a manager or as a leader or as an IO psychologist? And oftentimes it's education. People aren't really educated in our historical exclusion. And I think that's why it's so important that even we, for example, in Canada, indigeneity has been such a big issue right here. And so what they do now is integrate Indigenous curriculum and Indigenous history at the kindergarten level. Like at kindergarten level, you're learning about this. It's becoming a norm to at every level of the educational system. You have to know the Indigenous history within Canada. And we don't even have that for slavery or Indigenous in the US like that. So now here they have a whole reparation. It's societal. It's not just workplace. It's not just educational. It's societal. So that's why I said like we have to do what we best can do rather than just try to change a system that may not be ready.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lorena. And I agree, lots of going on in the chat about like making sure people don't feel attacked. And in my experience, it is like sensitive when you start even suggesting that somebody might need to think differently. So I've just started only giving my examples, putting a bump when I hear like something that sounds like so outrageous, like even merely stating like, oh, that hasn't been my experience. And just going back to personal experience and sort of just trying to neutralize, or even asking the person for more information, like, oh, what do you mean by that? Or, oh, tell me like what led you to say that or something. coming out of curiosity versus, but the judgment is definitely happening, but it's more like, oh, maybe I am misunderstanding. So let me ask for more info, you know, to try to have them explain what I think they mean. So.
Yeah, and one last thing, sorry, and then I'll end it there. But the other thing too, that when it comes to bias interventions and like even just kind of correcting other people, is you want to think about the relationship, right? So for example, with my mentor, like, you know, we often say like, oh, people of color, or again, any minoritized individual exerts a lot of emotional labor. And it's true, we do, especially when we want to correct people, but oftentimes it's necessary and there's a right way to do it, but it depends on the relationship that you have with the person, because they may be open to it, especially if they're your mentors, if they're your super, they really care. So I would say the nature of that relationship really matters. So sometimes I do let things go. Simply because I'm like, you know what, this person isn't part of my circle. I don't want to build community with them. Like, what's the point of me exerting emotion? Versus like when it's a supervisor or a manager or my mentor, I'm like, okay, like I really do have to address this because I want to maintain this relationship going. So the nature of relationship is also a factor that we should take into account when it comes to intervening.
I just want to bring what I'm typing into the chat in the discussion. There is a concept called reflexive anti-racism. And anti-racism in general can be applied to more than race and ethnicity, but it's really just acknowledging where we come from as like a society and how we've like the knowledge production and questioning authority systems, and just really recognizing that we all have work to do and that it's not an attack, it's just facts. It's just how we grew up in the society of today, that we all have biases towards different identity groups. And being reflexive about it just means that we're continuously questioning our beliefs and belief structures. And there's also a question about incentives for DEI, and I wasn't sure about like where in the organization like the incentives you're asking about, but adding questions for recruitment and incentivizing that in selection processes. So if you have a structural interview, you can add a question with about how they embody your diversity statement, or how they conceptualize diversity in it, and you can assess if it's aligned with your organization. You can also add them into performance reviews and add DEI as a competency that you value as performance within your organization. And then I've also seen, if you're trying to get people or departments to engage in trainings, some people have baked them into the incentive structures and policies. So you can't hire any more people until you, like everybody in your department has participated in this training, or you won't get like additional funding if you don't have a diversity statement for your specific department. So there are different reward structures that you can incentivize these things. And even if you don't want to make it mandatory, things like you can't hire people until you engage in this kind of makes it like a back-ended mandatory thing that I've seen some universities do.
I just wanted to add to that as well with the incentivizing is mentorship, especially in higher education and for faculty members. We often expect our minoritized faculty members or minoritized employees to provide mentorship, because mentorship is something that is lacking for a lot of students, a lot of people, junior faculties, a lot of junior, more early career people. And we don't realize that mentorship is a work. It takes a lot of work to do. And sometimes it like when we have so many other things to do in our job roles, and adding mentorship to it, it takes a toll on people. So are you incentivizing mentorship, right? People often can't provide mentorship if they have 1,000 other things to do as part of their job description. You know, and for faculty members, you know, typically we get, you know, we're incentivized based on the research that we produce, incentivized based on our teaching and our community service. And mentorship should be something that should be incentivized, right? Because we're often expected to mentor people, and we can be spread so thin and burn out that mentorship can be the last thing that we want to do, especially if there's so many few of us in these positions. Yeah, it's really hard. So how do you get people to mentor? Do you have mentoring programs? Are people getting rewarded for mentoring? Are people have time allocation to mentor? These things can be a huge, make a huge difference as well.
I think we have time for like another question or two if anybody has anything they want to ask.
So I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I think I love the idea. I'm from Hunter College. I love the idea that I think Lorena shared, which is sort of deciding what's appropriate and what battles to sort of take on, because this type of work can be very exhausting based on the approach your institution has, or even the sort of place you are in your own life in a particular day or moment, right? And what was interesting and very bold in that approach is that people often, I think, find it easy to have the conversation with the people that are of little consequence sometimes, right? And doesn't mean they're unimportant in life, but they may be unimportant in your interaction. So you can yell about it with someone on the street that's doing something crazy, but having the difficult conversation like this with a supervisor or a mentor, those are the examples you gave. So I think that's a really courageous way to think about it, and to be more energized about this type of work by not seeing it as something that you have to, it may be one's life's work, it may be a philosophical approach to one's life, but it might just be something that you segregate and spend time on when you have the energy to do it, sort of just to sustain yourself, right? Because it can be difficult if you're faced with these challenges. So I just really appreciated that perspective on the issue.
Yeah, thank you. And I do, because it sounds cheesy and it sounds this and that, but yeah, doing this work, Audre Lorde says that, self-love is a radical love. It's a radical movement, especially in these times, right? And academia is not any different. So, I've had people say like, oh, you're too nice because you corrected your advisor. And I'm like, I get something out of him. He builds my career. So of course, like, it's not about being nice. It's about understanding that relationship and understanding that at the end of the day, he's going to be in my life forever and he's going to provide opportunities. And I can't have a good relationship with him, regardless if he's a male and white, if I'm not open with him. So he's meeting me halfway. And that's the thing about like minoritized individuals, and I hate this conversation. I hate allyship work, because allyship makes it seem like, oh, allyship always centers still whiteness, or like centers the majority. And I'm like, there's something that goes on with minoritized people that they have to kind of also meet them halfway. Right. And that takes a lot of emotional labor. So I like the idea of co-conspiring, because we're working in partnership. We're both on this together, right? We both have goals. We have something that we get out of it. So I like co-conspiring or community building, because again, it takes everybody, and allyship only centers white people and what they can do, rather than if we talk about it as co-conspirers or like, community building, it's like we're all working together. We're all trying to like undo this system, because it disadvantages all of us regardless of our identities, rather than it just advantages white people. So allyship always is a little bit trickier, but I use words like co-conspiring or community building, because it centers the needs of everyone rather than just one person.
Thank you.
Harmony, you're wondering about the top-down approaches, and honestly, working in higher education, I have found it that it is incredibly political working in higher education. There is a very strict hierarchy, and getting top leadership to buy into this is incredibly important. But the thing is, once you get that buy-in, we know that policies work. So there's something like the Crown Act that is for the hair texture. Like, you can't discriminate based on hair texture, and now it's a policy, and now you have to abide by it. And with higher education, there are strategic initiatives. And if you frame DEI as in line with the strategic initiative of the university, there's no way that there is a way that leadership can say no. But if you frame it in that way, you're more likely to get buy-in by saying that, hey, this is in line with the goals that you have set for the university. And to like put in very clear and measurable goals and how you're going to do it. And even if you do like a very simple initiative and show that, hey, tie it into student success, saying that these DEI initiatives are making our organization be more aware of the equity gaps in our students. This is for student success. Baking it into that is helpful for like leadership to be more aware of it. Just saying that this is one in line with the strategic initiatives of the organization. This is in line with their 5-year, 10-year, 15-year plan. And unfortunately, like doing the business case for diversity is pretty strong as well. And there's a lot of articles showing the monetary benefits of this. If that's what like they also care about, there are a lot of resources for that I can send. But honestly, with the performativeness too, like just getting people to change their behavior in a way at work, like sometimes just getting that behavior change and then the cognition will follow. Sometimes it's the cognition change and then the behavior will follow. So I'm totally okay with people doing like DEI work for performative reasons, if that means that there's going to be an actual change in the organization. Sometimes it's for better or for worse, but getting people to actually care is really tough. And if organizational leadership changes, that like just signals a culture change. So people may attrition out if that is not in line with their personal values. And that is just something that leadership has to consider as well, if it is like a drastic shift. But CUNY, as you said, is like very diverse in many different ways. So doing DEI work within CUNY system is just very clearly aligned with strategic goals.
Perfect. And since we're about that time, I just want to wrap things up. I heard a lot about DEI, and I think some of the good stuff that I heard a lot was, how do we implement this into policies, regulations, right? Specifically, if there's people in power who can maybe bring up these conversations or who can bring a little bit more to the table and help others who might not be that much aware about DEI. So some of the things we'll just wrap up on is this, we'll have this on our IO network website, so we'll definitely post it on the chat real quick so you guys can actually look at that, see some of the resources, see some of the conversations we had. We want to thank Rebecca and Lorena for really coming in here today and taking your time to really share a little bit about that. And thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone.